competitiveness is not undermined. I believe that this proposal in itself constitutes interference with the work of member states. So in normal circumstances, I'm not in favour of the European Parliament taking an over-activist stance, but new negotiations were agreed yesterday on a new proposal for VAT. The Czech Prime Minister commented on the proposals as being bombastic, but I believe if we lower the burden on taxpayers, that's all well and good, but we can't just rob Peter to pay Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Balshaw.
Elnök úr, köszönöm a szót. Az áfa a tagállamok
Thank you, President. It is a major problem for revenues that often there is a lack of alignment between certain types of VAT and other taxes. In fact, we need to introduce a system to bring clarity, to make sure there are fair conditions in the single market. In actual fact, the differences between one member state and another member state mean that sometimes there are differences according to where the purchase was made, and we need to resolve that with an IT system. This directive could actually make up these shortcomings. So it's an important step forward.
I voted in favour of this report, which seeks to introduce important measures that will simplify cross-border trade, reduce VAT fraud and minimise compliance costs for businesses. This update to the current EU VAT system would be particularly needed in years to come, as fraud continues to increase and becomes an even more pressing issue. It is crucial for businesses across the EU that excessive compliance costs can be reduced, and I welcome that this is reflected. Additionally, it is extremely important that the heavy administrative burden on member states because of a lack of harmonisation is eased, and this text will help to ensure that this is the case. I also welcome the text relating to new status for certified taxable persons, which, once effectively harmonised across the EU, will be a significant step in simplifying the VAT system across the Union. I was also pleased to vote in favour of musical instruments being able to qualify for reduced rates of VAT should a member state choose to do so. It's important we would recognise and help the creative industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. Let's now move on to the next explanation of vote on health technology assessment. I give the floor to Mr. Ostrovicius.
Mr. Chair, colleagues, there are well-grounded concerns about the functioning of the EU medicines system, as the new medicines are very expensive and a big percent of them do not bring better results than the ones previously circulating in the market. The EU-wide health technology assessments will be an evidence and the uniform criteria-based process of evaluation and comparison of health standards and technologies in the member states. This assessment should speed up access to medicines to patients, provide guarantees on medicines quality and reduce the bureaucratic burden, as only one assessment instead of one assessment in each member state would be needed. Finally, Mr. Chair, I also support the proposals to the text to include the necessary additional flexibility to member states to meet certain national requirements, this way respecting member states' subsidiarity. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Drojewski.
The European Parliament points out to many actions suggesting that we do not only need a new directive that would make it easier to harmonize the rules concerning all the parties in this huge area, but there is much more to be done. I'm pointing out to this because what we have just voted does not guarantee a satisfactory progress. However, this challenge was necessary to be taken, but it was too late.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marias.
The Troika has allowed the Greek people to become impoverished, and this has meant that the Greek people are not able to get adequate medicines to cater for their health. We've seen a dramatic rise in the prices of prescribed medicines, and people are no longer able to afford them. It illustrates that Greece has been subjected to the powers of the international big pharma, and people who are ill feel themselves obliged to do without the more expensive drugs simply because they don't have the money available. So the multinational pharmaceutical companies' dominance must have an end, and the strict macroeconomic requirements that have brought the problems to Greece must be put to an end to.
Señor Balso.
Thank you very much, Mr. Balso.
Thank you, President. The purpose behind this proposal is that health technologies be subject to a joint Europe-wide assessment. That's extremely important for our citizens, since Eurobarometer has shown how close this issue lies to European citizens' hearts, and that on a number of occasions. More than 10% of Union GDP goes into the health sector, so it's vital that detailed scrutiny can be given and that there be wider spread agreement on assessment procedures. In this way, we shall be able, amongst other things, to enhance the competitiveness of the European health industry. That's an important step, which is why I supported this.
Thank you, Mr. Scheinfeld.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you, President. For over 60 years, we have been building this community, so it's high time to harmonize many areas, many sectors. Also, that of health technology, especially that they apply to the most important value for a human being, that is to our health. As many colleagues have said, our health is sometimes dependent on health technologies, on medicines. And sometimes these medicines are not very efficient. Very often they are very expensive. This harmonization of the effectiveness of medicines and health procedures might lead to lesser bureaucracy when it comes to admitting new medications on the market, but at the same time it may also increase their efficiency, and this is what we want. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Faria.
Gracias, President.
Thank you, President. I voted in favour of this report. I believe that health technology assessment will help promote investment and bring us some real economies of scale for health for the benefit of patients and the community as a whole. Thanks to these assessments, there will be proper input from everyone. It's a balanced proposal based on cooperation amongst member states while leaving scope for national authorities to avoid overlap and ensure there's less asymmetry in health access in Europe. Above and beyond the efforts of national agencies, we need to get patient representatives involved so that we can ensure there's more than just clinical statistics used to establish the added therapeutic value of a given treatment. we have to have an eye on the quality of life of patients, so the process has to be as transparent as possible so as to ensure there's confidence in the whole chain of adoption.
Yes. Pasamos.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to the next report on emission performance standards for new passenger cars and for new light commercial vehicles. Explanation of the vote for the following members. First of all, Mrs. Strojová, you have the floor.
Děkuji za udělení slova. Já bych chtěla vysvětlit, proč jsem...
Thank you, President. I would like to explain why I did not vote to change the emission performance standards for new vehicles. A reduction of carbon emissions is very important in the fight against climate change, and the Union is a leader here. The Commission has proposed a 30% reduction up to 2030. I think that was quite a rational proposal. I was in favour of a compromise of 35% that is fairly ambitious. In our group, however, the position was for 30 or 35%. The Parliament adopted 40%. I think that's counterproductive. The European automobile industry will not be sufficiently competitive. We are going to give ground to imports from China, but I hope we'll have discussions with member states. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ostrovicius.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The European Parliament today has pushed further on the Commission's proposal to reduce CO2 car emissions of the new cars in the EU market to at least 40% reduction by 2030. I'm really happy for the political will and ambition showed by the Parliament in this regard. I fully support the aim of the proposal to help member states to reach the EU climate commitments of the Paris Agreement via transport sector by incentivising the best use of production of the new technologies such as electric vehicles. This vote also was motivated by reading the impact assessment, which has estimated that this proposal could possibly create up to 70,000 new jobs in the European Union and will allow our citizens to save up to 17 billion a year on fuel. Lastly, the decision to reduce the environmental pollution will also significantly reduce the EU's geopolitical dependencies on transport fuel imports, and it carries on a very clear geopolitical message. Thank you, Chair.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Mrs. González Peñas.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you, President. I'd like to say how happy I feel on the adoption of the Dalli report on emissions. This is a great step forward in the industry in the context of climate change. We have to bring an end to tricks in measuring of CO2 emissions. Lab test conditions are not enough. We can't allow any recurrence of the Dieselgate scandal. That's why it's important that we've adopted a premium for those who exceed the minimum standards for low emission vehicles, together with sanctions on those who fail to do this. It's also important that this will be a gradual, realistic transition period, avoiding a position where our automobile industry might face a Nokia scenario, failing to keep up to date and sinking on that side. The green transition might lead to a 1% reduction in the number of jobs in this sector, but there will be thousands of new jobs in more sustainable industries in recompense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. González. Mr. Messerschmidt.
It's a bit of a beauty contest to see what would happen in the Environment Committee in the course of this process through to the vote today, with very ambitious proposals that the various groups put forward. We ended with a good compromise, and in our delegation, in our group, we were able to support that, partly because it's obviously important to do something for the climate. But A topic which is somewhat forgotten in this debate is the fact that we're dealing here with our strategic and major political dependencies. And when we import very large quantities of oil, gas, and coal, this is from regimes and states which we ordinarily would want to have nothing to do with in the Middle East, Russia, etc. And it's important, therefore, that I think we talk about that dimension of the whole provision of energy aspect. Who is it that we're allying ourselves with? And it obviously is the Western Alliance with the US at the lead, NATO, and not the various regimes in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sośnierz.
To kolejna nieodpowiedzialna.
This is yet another very irresponsible resolution of this parliament. You are trying to pass laws without an in-depth knowledge of the area, and then you will have to try to make some corrections. You will have to make up for the lost time. This is unfortunately the direction in which we are going. If this is how you want to solve the problem of traffic jams, for example, in Strasbourg, then my congratulations. I voted against.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. Schoenfeld.
Thank you very much, President. Environmental protection and especially quality of our air is one of the most objectives right now for our civilization, I would say. So that is why I'm very happy that we make a lot of effort and we invest a lot of money in that area. However, everything that we should do has to be done rationally, has to be done in a streamlined way. So we cannot do something at the cost of or at the expense of something else. So this brings me back to our nature, to our environment that must be fit for our life. But also we must not forget about human beings who are part of this environment, who also deserve well-being and welfare. So on the one hand, we have objectives for environmental protection, and on the other hand, we have social policy, and they have to be well combined together at the levels of state and the level of the European Union. And a compromise might have been a good solution. However, we went much further, and this is not a very rational approach.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. Polčák.
Pane předsedo, já jsem tento návrh.
President, I was not able to support this proposal because the initial proposal to reduce emissions of new vehicles by 30% up to 2030 with respect to 2021, I thought that was realistic. Even the stricter proposal adding 5% to 35%, I thought that was acceptable and reasonable. However, I do not want us to agree on overambitious objectives, and I do think 40% reduction is simply too ambitious and unrealistic, unfortunately. The definition of these limits should reflect the needs for change linked to the climate and protection of the climate and Paris Agreement, but also the possibilities of the automobile industry, which amounts to thousands of jobs in Europe. So we've got to incentivize the car industry to produce low-emission vehicles. However, we should not adopt measures that are going to have a draconian impact and influence the prices. Thank you.
Señor Faria.
Mr. Faria.
Muchas gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. I voted in favour of this report because we can't take any longer on the environment. By 2030, we have to turn around the disaster situation of global warming caused by greenhouse gas emissions. We must have a value of more than the 40% reduction. The Commission's proposals are not enough, and they're far too rosy. The experience shows us that the car industry has systematically failed to meet the standards and has used all sorts of subterfuge to get around them. We need a political will now to set out a clear course of action to phase out fossil fuels, going for electric and based on renewables and cutting down on gas emissions. There are huge benefits from this, as well as lowering emissions. Will make the European industry more competitive, create more jobs, and make us less dependent on fuel imports. By going for low and no emissions, we'll end up with obvious savings for citizens and improvement in air quality. So this is a vote for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Howarth.
Thank you for calling me, Mr. President. I am delighted to support this report today, particularly the 40% reduction target for 2030 for both cars and light vans. It's a big step forward in the ambition of the European Union. And everyone who has, as I have, dealt with transport policy and looked at emissions from transport knows that without serious action on emissions from vehicles, you will not meet climate targets and you will not address key problems of air quality in urban areas. And every time we've had a step forward on this, we've had to have the automotive industry dragged kicking and screaming in the direction of reform. But they have nothing to fear, because this will make the industry more competitive in the future, and it is essential that we have just transition funding for workers who would otherwise be potentially thrown out of work because of these changes. I believe they have nothing to fear if we do this properly.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next report, Sanji, on rates of value-added tax. First of all, Mr. Messerschmidt.
One of the key things about national sovereignty is to have control of the budget and of tax collection and the way in which we do tax trade. And this is why we voted against this report. We don't want to be contributing to having an upper limit in the EU on VAT payments. It should principally be up to the member states to decide on how to finance their budgets. And if the EU is going to finance its budget, then it should be the member states that get the taxes in and not the EU itself. So the whole line that this report has set out is one that we fundamentally oppose, because it leads to further federalization of the budgetary and financing system in Europe. And I think it's not that which the Europeans want, and that we voted against.
Gracias. Señor Zdrojewski.
Thank you. Mr. Zdrojewski next.
Technical corrections of the VAT directive are inevitable. I have seen many issues with this directive ever since its publication. Let's remember that 10 years ago, various countries were covered by various rates, 0%, 5%, even 22 or 23%. A few days ago, the Council agreed for the e-books, electronic books, to be covered by a reduced VAT rate. However, this debate shows how much there is to be done in this area, so I'm very happy that we are tackling this task. I have supported this directive and this report, and I hope that in the future we will react much more quickly to the changes that take place on the market. Thank you.
Señor Marías.
Mr. Marias, you have the floor.
I already spoke about value-added tax rates. Now, of course, remote regions would be disadvantaged if VAT rates are increased. On the Aegean Islands, we need more moderate VAT rates. At the moment, Turkey has a rate of 5%. And I've said again and again that the Greek Greek government and the Troika are asking for the highest rate of tax, 24%, even on the Aegean Islands, even though hundreds of thousands of refugees have landed on these islands. So we want a special VAT rule for the Aegean Islands, as is the case for Campania in Italy and the Lake Lugano, where the regions have a lowered rate of VAT because of the huge competition with Switzerland. So we need something similar for the rates on the Aegean Islands so that they can survive, so they can keep their economy afloat.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Now we'll take explanations of the vote on the motion for resolution on the International Financial Reporting Standards, IFRS 17, insurance contracts. Mr. Messerschmidt has the floor.
One of the areas where globalization really has cut through is in the financial sector. And I think we're all aware of that and have been over the last decade, starting with the financial crisis, which was a bit of an eye-opener, and then we see what happened after that. So there's a good motivation behind new rules for insurance agreements that provide for a greater degree of transparency and comparativeness. In line with international globalization developments, more and more consumers are going to need instruments which they can easily compare with other products across borders. And I think one of the things that the Econ Committee has come up with regard to insurance is going to be benefit to many consumers, and that's why I voted in favour. Thank you.
Gracias, señor Bol.
Thank you, Mr. Boltar. Thank you, President. We're talking here about international accounting standards, the IFRS, in this instance, building on insurance contracts. The standards have been used by the European Union in the instance of assets quoted on the stock exchange. As far as the insurance sector is concerned, there are a number of differences, particularly the registration of profits and losses. Now, in the report, a reference is made to harmonizing rules on accounts amongst the various groups of countries, the purpose being to ensure that the insurance industry have a clearer picture and it'll be easier to compare figures from one country to another. I voted in favour. The President. And now explanations of vote on distributed ledger technologies and blockchains, building trust with disintermediation. Mr. Zahradil has the floor.
Děkuji, pane předsedající. Je velmi
Thank you, President. I think it's a very good thing that the European Parliament is now beginning to consider the new elements in the digital economy, blockchain, distributed ledger technologies, simplification of data, etc., these new phenomena. After all, these are transnational global issues and they should be on the agenda of the European Parliament. These are also elements that are going to have a huge influence on the digital arena in the future, the information flows and the economy. I supported this report and I would urge that when we think about legislation for these new phenomena, we have to be cautious because these are very sensitive matters, as we've seen in the past when we talked about internet and regulation of various features linked to the internet. It wasn't always well regulated. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Next, we have explanations of vote on a motion for resolution regarding the EU agenda for rural, mountainous and remote areas. Ms. Šojdrová has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. I wish to explain why I supported the report on the European Union programme for mountainous and remote areas. This report covers territory which amounts to about 80% of our entire territory in the European Union, and yet only has about 20% of the population, so it's a very large area with a rather low population density. But nevertheless, it is extremely important when it comes to agricultural production and the quality of our environment and the production of oxygen and water retention as well. These are all important features which deserve our attention and our support. People living in these areas also need the same quality of services as elsewhere, and that's why we should not see an undermining of those policies which try and uphold infrastructure and the quality of services, whether it be agricultural common policy or whatever.
Gracias, señor Nekov.
Thank you. Mr. Nekov, you have the floor. Thank you, President. Colleagues, rural, mountain and remote areas cover a wide swathe of the European Union. Some of these regions lack a whole range of services, such as social services, and it's hard for them to obtain access to decent digital infrastructure. There's widespread ageing of the population in these areas. Lots of lack of employment. The blame has to be laid at the door of those governments who fail to take the necessary steps to implement recommendations. Bulgaria adopted a targeted program to develop the northeastern corner of the country from the Rodop area down, but unfortunately that got filed away in a back drawer somewhere. The Bulgarian government needs to take specific steps as quickly as possible to provide opportunities in these areas of Bulgaria. In the northwest of Bulgaria, people are just as European as anyone else in the Union. The President, thank you. I can't see Mr. Mato in the chamber. Indeed, she's not here, so I shall give the floor to Mr. Viegas. Thank you. Portugal, following the recent wave of forest fires, demonstrates the failure of the EU austerity agenda. European policy is clearly leading to the desertification of the countryside, with people being forced into city areas. And now we have to deplore the fact that the MFF has less money for cohesion and the CAP, with more going into security and defence, sticking to the basic thrust of the EU budget, which is going to create further social problems for remote and mountainous areas. Well, let's be serious about this. The Portuguese Communist Party sees that the fight against asymmetry goes much further than cohesion policy. We have to do away with the bottlenecks that flow from EU policy, whether it be the euro or the single market. That's the only way that in Portugal we will be able to deliver a balanced regional development policy for the benefit of the local people. Thank you. Mr. Sosnierz, you have the floor.
To sprawozdanie to jest po prostu koncert życzeń. Chcecie dofinansować.
This report is a wish list, basically. You want everything to be financed by taxpayers' money, just because these people are far away from the center. But why? If this is not profitable, then these people should move, and they should not stay there where at the taxpayers' cost. They should have a new transport network, for example. You want to send buses there, and we have just adopted a report on fewer emissions, less emissions. You don't know what you want to do. You have very unclear goals, people.
Muchas gracias, señor Polčák.
Thank you. Mr. Polčák, the floor.
Děkuji, pane předsedo.
Thank you very much, President. I supported this project, unlike Mr. Sośnierz, I think it is very important to help people who live in these regions, and I don't wish for 80% of the European population within 10 years to live in huge agglomerations and conurbations. I don't think that would be right. I think if everybody or the majority of people were to move to these big conurbations, no, I think we should support lifestyles in mountainous and far-flung regions because they certainly merit it. Agriculture is important, and we should be investing in transport infrastructure, education, teaching, health and social care, and so Mr. Schroeder was talking about a very large area, and we really do have to respect the people that live there.
Thank you, Mr. Zahardil.
Pane předsedo, já jsem tuto zprávu.
Thank you, President. I supported this report because I consider that it is partially the duty, and I stress partially the duty of the EU to focus on these rural, mountainous and remote areas. We know, however, that the European budget is limited. It's not going to be able to expand, and that's why these issues need to be linked to the common agricultural policy that is still based on production. We need to change it, however, to develop these regions so that infrastructure is developed and networks to increase the standard of living and protect nature, water, and the environment in general. This has to go hand in hand with the restructuring of the budget, and I hope this report is a first step.
Gracias. Señor Zenger.
Thank you. Mr. Scheinfeld next.
Panie Przewodniczący.
Thank you, President. Here in the European Parliament, and not only here, we devote a lot of attention to urban policy. And that's no wonder, because more people live in the cities than in the rural areas. Also, the contribution to the GDP of the rural areas is very small. However, equality, sustainable development, these values require us to treat the rural, mountainous and remote areas in an appropriate way, also the people who live there. I would like to underline one thing. We cannot come to the conclusion that we do not take these people's needs into account. No, we reserve a lot of money in the cohesion policy, in the CAP, for those goals, for those objectives, for those regions, and for those people. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señorías.
Thank you, honourable members. The sitting is adjourned until 3 p.m. Thank you.